We'll start with this with a lunch hour session here. My name is Kenton Posberg. My wife and I farm at Humboldt, Saskatchewan. A number of surprise decisions from PMRA have placed Canadian farmers in jeopardy in terms of access to critical tools. This challenge becomes even more profound when one considers that competitors in the U.S. are unlikely to face any such restrictions going forward. Dennis Prouse of CropLife Canada will outline the challenges faced by the industry when it comes to PMRA and reevaluation, and why regulatory modernization is critical to the future of Canadian agriculture. Dennis is Vice President, Government Affairs at CropLife Canada, communicating the vision of CropLife Canada to elected officials, political staff, and senior public servants at all levels of government. Dennis spent 5 years working on Parliament Hill, including 3 years in the Prime Minister's office. Dennis has also served on the Board of Directors of the Government Relations Institute of Canada for 6 years. He has also been recognized for 6 consecutive years on the Hill Times annual list of top 100 lobbyists in Ottawa. Well, welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Ken. The part that Ken left out is I think there was only 105 registered lobbyists in the year that they did that. Want to thank everybody for having me and for a wonderful excuse to come out to the West Coast. Always enjoy being at Western Canadian wheat growers. Tremendous. We were talking about it last night. In fact, your ears must have been burning talking about the fact that Western Canadian wheat growers are always right in the thick of the fight and punching way above their weight, which makes us want to go out and do the same. So greatly appreciate all you do. It doesn't go unrecognized. Pleased, but also it's a little unnerving. My former boss Ted Menzies is here to critique my speech and pass on whether it was okay or not. I have a member of Parliament here. Boy, I have board members here, so I'll see if I can pass the audition. Wanted to talk about regulatory reform because it is such a critical issue. At the same time, we'll talk a little bit about the CFIA side of that and also the glyphosate issue. I know that's hot, that's always topical. And there is actually a little glimmer of hope out there because it's never all doom and gloom. And I want to talk a little bit about maybe what the path forward might be to try to address some of these issues. So always put up the always put up the membership slide. The membership slide has changed a little bit in the last year or two, but about every couple of months, our communications staff sends us a new one and says, make sure you use this one in all your presentations. It has changed. So, but here we are pleased. We're in a great position insofar as all the major players in the industry are members of CropLife. Not every trade association gets to say that. We're quite fortunate that we can say that, and again, we don't take that for granted. I could spend a whole bunch of time talking about, what I think the top issues are in Ottawa, what the horse race numbers look like, and, frankly, I'd be regurgitating a whole bunch of stuff that, you yourselves read. This one slide, though, I think is the one thing I think people should understand going forward. And Randy and I were talking about this just offline before lunch. It's just that the old models of news gathering and of media have just completely fractured. There's people my age, got used to a model where, the news got delivered at 6, the news got delivered at 10 and 11, and then again in the morning in the broadsheet newspaper, and that's what the news was. Well, not anymore. Those old models are gone. It's now niche. It's now customized. People have their news delivered 24/7 in rapid fire on their phone, and they choose what news sources they want to get. I mean, the old running joke is, show me your social media feed and profile, and I'll tell you who you vote for, because people are now customizing that feed. All those fake news stories are out there with no fact checking. I was greatly amused by the fact that the federal government thinks they can stop that. There's some kind of committee that's going to be out there to look at fake news stories during the campaign, and the notion of some ineffectual assistant deputy minister trying to plug the holes in the dike of the internet was rather amusing to contemplate. They're going to give it the old college try. And I think the bottom one is important. You have activist groups now who can deliver their messages very cheaply and very effectively, through targeted media. I mean, just through Facebook ads, Google ads, micro websites that pop up overnight. And so that's the environment in which we live in. It's the old story, good news, everyone's a journalist now. Bad news, same thing, everyone's a journalist now. So I mean, I just understand that as we head into this election year, that it's an environment that is, political environment that's unlike one we've ever seen before, and it's very chaotic. On to the actual issue of reeval. And this is an issue that, there's a lot of people in this room, people like my friend Paul Thiel have, sweated over this, tremendously, as have many. And because it is really, and I've said this a few times, this is an existential threat to the future of modern agriculture in Canada if it was left unchecked. What are the problems with that process? And our concern, obviously, is that if that process is left unchecked, it'll eventually reach the point, as was said in the introduction, that Canadian farmers aren't going to have access to the tools of modern agriculture that they need, and that we would start heading down the road where Canadian farmers are starting to face some of the same conditions that European farmers are, and we don't feel that's an exaggeration. What are they doing? Well, there's overly conservative assumptions. There's no look at cost-benefit analysis. They will very stoically tell you that, nope, that's not their job. It's not our mandate. Our mandate's health and safety only. So you have a federal government that, as you'll see in the bottom slide, is talking about $75 billion in ag exports by 2025. I believe the current figure for the last year available was $56 billion. That's an aggressive expansion. You're going to see this afternoon on a tour, the Port of Vancouver, just what they'll need to deal with that. And those who went to Grow Canada heard a little bit about that. So here's the rest of the federal government, all chock full of enthusiasm about ag. We're hearing about ag more than we ever have. And then it runs into about a 2-foot cement wall at Health Canada, where, nope, sorry, we don't look at, shame on you for talking about those grubby economic issues. We only deal with health and safety of Canadians. So, but PMRA themselves have recognized that reeval process is not working. They've initiated a 2-year review and consultation process. I mean, stop me if you've heard this before, right? In government, there's going to be a consultation process. Well, we don't have 2 years. They need to support the sector now. And there are critical tools for farmers, like the 3 active neonics that are out for review, and that are going to be a huge, huge problem. So this isn't 2 years. This has to be now. They need to do a proper cost-benefit analysis and rely on real-life applicable monitoring information for the Canadian countryside, and not just theoretical modeling. On the one, the one active that they were looking at, I mean, they were looking at largely at data that was collected from Ontario. And looking at that, they decided to go make an interim decision that would apply to everyone across the country. So you're now going to look at a situation where wheat growers, canola farmers in Western Canada are going to lose access to tools because there was concern about some greenhouses in southwestern Ontario. PMRA's come back to that as well. We're mandated by the legislation to do, to act if we feel there's a threat. Well, in our view, the legislation then needs to change. Onto that momentarily. So there's the sort of a big picture view of what the threat is. And like I say, it's highly significant, especially when you consider that our largest competitor across the border, are highly unlikely to be facing any of these. And the contrast in the way that US EPA has approached their situation, is very high. And it shouldn't be, because we allegedly now have a regulatory cooperation council. Again, that's breaking down in real life situations. There's a slide on the workload, and here's the issue. 2017 to 2028, this is PMRA's own numbers, and this is the, and I call it the tennis ball moving through the garden hose, right, of the number of reevals that they're facing. And they themselves acknowledge that this workload is huge, and that they're not going to be able to keep up, and they'll need a fundamentally different way at dealing with this when you look at the workload. There's a bit of I talked just a minute ago about Canada-US. There's a contrast between how we measure up with the US in terms of two-way dialogue and transparency, and where stakeholders like yourselves have an opportunity to actually be involved in the process. It's a fairly stark contrast. And again, I think it's a fairly vivid visual as to why we think that re-eval needs fundamental change. How do we fix it? Well, our view is two-way dialogue, early and ongoing dialogue with affected stakeholders throughout the process. That was happening, then it stopped happening. Well, it stopped happening because they were trying to catch up, frankly. And so the fastest way to catch up was to stop doing that. That's not good enough. Canadian agriculture is at stake. Stakeholders deserve to be heard from. Adequate resources and efficiency gains. Resources are important, and we have supported increased resources for PMRA, but we don't want to make it just about that, because we don't want anybody to think that if they just add, a whole bunch of FTEs, that all of a sudden that's addressed the problem. It's not just about that. It's about a fundamentally different way of looking at it. Yes, resources are important. Yes, we believe they should have more resources, but if we emphasize just that, there's a danger and that becomes the entire focus. Considering competitive and economic impacts. We think they must consider competitive factors. This mandate is clearly set out in the Pest Control Products Act. It's consistent with the approach of other trading partners. We have a bit of a disagreement with them on that, and there actually is hopefully some federal help on the way on that, which I'll get to in a few moments. Consider the cost benefit of alternative products. That wasn't being done. So they were coming in with a re-eval and saying, okay, so as a, the proposal will be a five-year phase out of, say, imidacloprid. Well, what's the cost benefit of the alternative? What's the environmental impact of spraying the alternative? Well, the legislation doesn't mandate us to look at that. Well, why doesn't it? Had all these fixes been in place that we talked about, we don't think we'd be talking about lucin clothianidin and thimethoxam today. And by the way, Paul, I've worked really hard on pronouncing those, and it flows off the tongue now. It didn't right at the very beginning. So I credit Maria Trainer for helping me on that. She gave me good assistance. So, we wouldn't be in this situation. We've had discussions with government. The government has said that they view that if there is a significant gap between an interim decision and a final decision, that's an indication of a problem, and we nod vigorously and said, yeah, we couldn't agree more. So there's re-eval in a nutshell. I'm going to get to some of the fixes on that in a sec. I do want to talk about glyphosate, though, because it has been in the news to a fair degree. You probably saw in early January some good news. We always say we never get good news. Well, we got some good news, and the good news being that Health Canada dealt with the notices of objection that were raised on their re-eval of glyphosate. They assigned an entirely separate team of 20 staff who hadn't dealt with the original. They said it was extremely difficult to actually find those people. And I think you could tell from their language that they were slightly irked that they were having to deal with this yet again. They used phrases like they left no stone left unturned. We like that. We highlighted that in our release. And they pointed out again that there isn't one pesticide regulator in the world who has deemed glyphosate to be a carcinogen. Again, not one pesticide regulator in the world has made that determination. You'd never know that from the activists, hue and cry. But some have heard of IARC, and I want to walk through the IARC situation because I think it's important. Well, what is IARC? Well, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So the monographs that they produce are an exercise in evaluating cancer hazards. They place glyphosate in group 2A, probable human carcinogen. There's the groups, 1, 2A, 2B, group 3, group 4. You'll see some of what's in group 1, asbestos, alcoholic beverages, processed meats. We're all in a lot of trouble. There's the group 2A, shift work, red meat, glyphosate, and now you're seeing coffee in group 2B. So you're starting to see how, the difference between hazard versus risk, which leads me to this slide. I always love this. What is hazard? What is risk? And we as an industry haven't done a really great job of explaining this, and we need to do better. Driving on a road is a hazard. Driving in a blizzard is a risk. Shaving is a hazard. Shaving a bear is a risk. Using a blow dryer is a hazard. Using it in the bathtub is a risk. And, we laugh, but that is the fundamental difference between hazard and risk. IARC was looking at hazard. We look at risk, and this is actually the fundamental difference between how Europe regulates and how we regulate, and which has led to some of the difficulties we've had. Glyphosate, what did PMRA have to say about the IARC finding? Well, World Health Organization's IARC recently assigned a hazard classification. It's important to note that a hazard classification is not a health risk assessment. Level of human exposure, which determines actual risk, was not taken into account. Pesticides are registered for use in Canada only if the level of exposure to Canadians does not cause any harmful effects, including cancer. Their words. Well, cue the outrage, right? And you're seeing a lot of this. You're seeing the signs everywhere. That one on the bottom right is highly problematic, by the way. I know New Brunswick doesn't pop up on the radar of folks in Western Canada much, but there is a strong movement. It's not a lot of people, but they're well organized and they're loud, who want glyphosate spraying stopped in forestry in New Brunswick. It's used to manage forests, and all the usual woo, as we call it, as a catch-all, being used, and they've managed to spook the politicians there. And that, by the way, and I've talked to some folks on this offline, this is where this is going to go now, by the way. Now that the activists have clearly lost in Ottawa, they're going to try to find sympathetic provincial governments where they can go take action on glyphosate, and if they can't win there, they'll try some sympathetic local governments and see if local governments can try to flex whatever jurisdictional muscle they might have, because they're not going to quit, but they'll just shift to the next levels of government. Some of the facts, obviously, everybody in this room knows these, and they know these better than I do, but it's important to kind of repeat these to ourselves almost as a daily affirmation. Used by more than 40 years, used by farmers around the world. These are our benefits messages, in essence. And again, I don't think we do a great job, and when I say we, I include us, that's everybody, in talking about the benefits. When you're talking about using something, what should we talk about? Well, we should talk about benefits. If somebody's selling you a new car or a new phone, they're talking about the benefits of it. Yeah, what do we always lead with? Well, we always lead playing defense, and then we're surprised things don't work out real well for us. Again, some of the regulatory agencies have weighed in on this. EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority has weighed in on this in the same way everyone else has. US EPA, Health Canada, European Chemicals Agency, Japan, Australia, Korea, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. This product does not increase the risk of cancer when used as intended. So, in essence on glyphosate, and I'm going to have these slides, and Dave can, pardon me, Dave can circulate these if folks want to use some of these. Please take whatever here is useful for you. But I think it's important for us to, stop apologizing for this and stop hiding from it and stand up, because, the activists aren't going to give up, and frankly, neither should we. There's some of the food safety issues you probably heard about, because now you're seeing the detection levels on food, right? There's glyphosate in your Cheerios, et cetera. And we were actually fairly heartened in our shop about what the reaction to that has been. We didn't see the massive public pushback that you were concerned about. In fact, some of the media were questioning some of this and talking about how ridiculous it is, and you'll see some of why. Bread. It takes 655 kilograms would have to be ingested daily to reach the acceptable daily intake on glyphosate. 655 kilos of bread. Hey, I like my bread too much, right? But I don't think I'm quite hitting 655 kilos. Ben & Jerry's. Deeply ironic we use Ben & Jerry's, because Ben & Jerry are a couple of hippies from Bernie Sanders' home state of Vermont. A 75-pound child would need to consume 145,000 8-ounce servings of Ben & Jerry's every day to hit the EPA safety limit. For adults, the number of servings jumps to 290,000. So, those are some of the there is a ton of good information out there on glyphosate, is the takeaway here. The detection issue is silly. We should be, standing up proudly, talking about the benefits messaging. We now have the backing of Health Canada on this. I mean, as far as the federal government's concerned, this issue is a done deal for the next decade, and we can move forward. It's going to be an issue internationally. The activists aren't going to quit, but like I say, neither should we. We'll talk about CFIA really briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this simply because there was a really good panel here before, but we are working in the same manner that we're working on PMRA issues. We are working on CFIA and trying to modernize that regulatory approach on seeds. We've fallen behind key global competitors on regulatory speed and efficiency, and we've been in front of House of Commons committees and Senate committees telling this story, and that essentially Canada started off with a good model, but we've fallen behind. It's now about 2 years from submission to approval, yet we know that the actual workload is about 2 months. It's about 2 months worth of work. So what it's led to is that when a submission goes in for a new trait, they don't even crack it open for a year. Why? Well, because it's a 2-year service standard. Why is it a 2-year service standard? Well, no one's quite sure, other than the fact that 2 years seem to kind of indicate sort of an appropriate level of rigor that would make the public feel good, right? So, where are our competitors? US is less than 2 years. Brazil is down to less than 1 year. Products of gene editing, even more difficult. Canada has now said it's on a case-by-case basis. The US has been very clear. If it's a product of gene editing, it's not going to be regulated. So Canada said case-by-case basis, because nothing quite encourages investor confidence quite like, submit it to us and we'll see. We'll let you know. That's not good enough. We need far more certainty than that. Talk about where the situation is globally, and it's what we're always trying to do in any of our advocacy work. We always want to point out, where is Canada relative to our global competitors? We are a trading nation, we're an exporting nation, and we have to keep up because, frankly, we are a plastic bag in the wind globally unless we keep up. There's the U.S. situation, South American bloc, efficient notification process to determine if gene edit plants are GMOs. Australia, simple gene-edited products will be exempt from GMO regulations. The EU, that's interesting. Pierre Patel is actually in Brussels right now. He had a meeting with our ambassador to the EU. It's tough in Europe. I actually got the better gig by coming here to Vancouver to see you guys than Pierre got going to Brussels. So you see where things are globally. But when you look at South America, you look at Australia, you look at the places where investment could potentially go, we're not keeping up with those competitors. View of Canadian plant breeders. Some of you would be more familiar with this than I, maybe. There was a survey that went out of plant breeders, and 20% of the approved in Canada were not subject to similar regulation in other countries. 47% of respondents chose not to undertake R&D after having self-determined that innovation is to be regulated. 31% of respondents considering conducting research outside Canada. So if you're a politician that's beating the drum on innovation, and I tell you, I mean, if people played a drinking game on the phrase innovation when they were in the House of Commons, they would fall over. I mean, it's politicians' favorite word. Yet, for all the preaching on innovation we're seeing, that's a 47% considering not to undertake R&D in Canada. Not great. Lost opportunity. I'm not going to run through all of this, but you're seeing some quotes there. I like number 4. Brazil has a different regulatory system. It looks like it should be pretty straightforward to get to market. People from the head of R&D at Corteva talking about the U.S. system. So again, we aren't in a vacuum in Canada. We're facing global competition. We need to keep up. What's needed now? CFI and Health Canada commitment to meaningful improvement, and development of a work plan and some early wins. The good news is that some of this was actually detailed in the fall economic statement, which I'm going to get to just in a moment. So there is a clear working plan. Our friends at Canada Grains Council, I stole these slides from Tyler, so who I think in turn had others do them up for him, so I didn't feel too badly. Again, I talked about that, and getting towards the end here. The federal government has professed an understanding and appreciation that competitiveness is an issue. So they outlined, the fall economic statement came out in November. Typically what the federal governments do is they have a fall economic statement in November, sort of a mini budget, if you will, which predates the full budget, which happens in February, March. We're getting signals that it may actually be the end of February, but who knows. But there was some really good stuff in the fall economic statement in terms of what they said was going to happen. Again, words are lovely, action is better, but here's some of what they said. Wanted to support business tax incentives, diversify trade, removing barriers to internal trade. Stop me if you've heard this before. But here's the best part, number 4. Modernizing regulations while continuing to protect the health and safety of Canadians and the environment. First time the federal government has actually said modernizing regulations, and these are their words. So we were like, wow, all of our outreach, and we've put on a really coordinated effort, ourselves, all the other grow partners, the grower groups, everybody's been pounding home with the same message, and it looks like it might actually have been heard. This is what they had to say about a more modern regulatory system. Approve new products faster, simplify regulations, reduce costs through harmonized regulations, support innovation through greater collaboration. This was all stuff that we've been advocating on tremendously. So, it's a hopeful sign. Here's some more of the granular detail on this. Explore making competitiveness a permanent part of regulatory mandates. That is huge. We need that. We desperately need that. We've been preaching that message in Ottawa to anybody who will stop to listen to us for the last number of years. And now, so now we need enabling legislation. We need something to actually get passed. But they actually said these words, so we're trying to hold them to it. Introduce an annual modernization bill to keep them up to date. Have an external advisory committee on competitiveness that would have actual business people on them. Launch a center for regulatory innovation. Enhance capacity to develop and implement effective regulations. That means some more resources for them. And take immediate action in response to business recommendations. Some of these recommendations came out of what was called the Barton Report. I don't know how many people were familiar with the Barton Report. Dominic Barton, who is was the global head of McKinsey and Associates, was their $1 a year man, looking at economic growth, and he was sort of this government's economic wise man. And his report to the federal government was actually very good. And Barton was extremely excited about agriculture. And he's somebody who doesn't have an ag background, but he just saw agriculture and agri-food as a tremendous underdeveloped potential for Canada and economic growth. He actually talked about touring Brazil and seeing the amazing work that's being done in Brazil, and he said the biting irony is that a lot of it was being underwritten by Canadian pension funds. So it's like, okay, great, why isn't that happening in Canada? So a lot of this came out of the Barton Report that was 2.5 years ago. So things take a while to percolate in Ottawa. So this is all really happy news, but now it actually needs enabling legislation and action upcoming in the federal budget. Then it actually needs to pass. Then the regulatory agencies actually have to implement what's been passed. So there's an awful long way to go, but there's a little glimmer of sunshine here, that some of this messaging has actually been heard, and we're going to keep pounding that home. Last issue, before I can hopefully take a couple questions, then you guys can get on the road. Trade. My friend James Moore is going to talk tomorrow morning on trade and do a way better job than I could ever do, but just to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the issues that will probably come up tomorrow morning. Obviously, we are huge free traders, right? We don't have any defensive interests, as government likes to say, right? We are purely about exports, whereas the supply managed sector has defensive interests. We are all about participating. Every time there's a federal government consultation on trade, we're there, and we make sure that all our friends and allies show up too. To say the same thing, that basically the barriers that we face are non-tariff in nature. China on canola approvals, people familiar with that story. The durum wheat in Italy story, Pierre again was over in Brussels. That was item number 1 on his meeting with the ambassador because, again, the fact that Italy is holding up Canadian durum wheat exports, that is the poster child for why you need strong science-based regulatory provisions in any trade agreement and a dispute settlement mechanism, because if you don't have that, you don't have much of a trade agreement. And that CPTPP is actually a pretty good model it's actually much better in terms of science-based regulatory provisions than is CETA. CETA's weak. Why is CETA weak on that? Well, the Europeans are allergic to biotech, so when you're trying to get a trade agreement done, what you do is you put aside the issues that you don't agree on and try to find some broad agreement on the issues that you do. Ergo, some of our critical issues got left. We'll work on that later. We'll have a committee and we'll look on that later. Well, it's now later, as it always is, and we have the durum wheat issue in Italy. So we just continue to pound the drum. It is science-based regulation. It is rules-based trade. Science-based regulation, rules-based trade. Did we mention science-based regulation? And we've had to do that, and as a result, it's now having some resonance. We're now seeing the federal government talking about science-based regulation, reflectively. I mean, I've heard the Minister of Ag talk about it a lot. It takes a long time. It takes a long time to kind of break through on that, but that is our mantra on trade issues, and it's the same mantra that our other grow partners has, and I have had, and I think it's had some positive impact. So there we go. With 7 minutes to get to your bus, I am assuming Dave will delay it slightly. There's my talk. There's some of the big issues that we're working on and that everyone else is working on. As I say, I will be not going to make the tour this afternoon, but I will be around to the reception. I'll be around at dinner. I'll be around tomorrow morning. Happy to answer questions now, or happy to talk to folks one-on-one afterwards. And as I say, I greatly appreciate the invite and always like being at this conference, Dave. Thank you for inviting me. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Sure. Yeah, happy.
We'll take one or two questions. We'll keep the questions short and the response short, and then we'll roll into the post-lunch activities.
Dennis, I know you and I have talked about a lot of these things quite a few times. Yeah. And I sat here and I wondered, and I think there's probably other people in the room who don't understand, the people doing this at Health Canada, the PMRA side, all those how subject to a political change or political will are those organizations? Or are they doing a good job of being totally separate? Does that continue?
Well, I think if you're an official at PMRA,
yeah,
your focus is the legislation. And right. We've heard the executive director of PMRA say quite regularly, I have to respond to the legislation. So if there's a change in legislation, he'll respond. If his deputy minister tells him that there's been a change in approach directed by that deputy's minister, then he will change his approach. Absent of direct instruction, he's not going to freelance. He is going to stick to what he knows. I'll give you a quick example of that. There was all this wonderful warm talk about the Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council, but it was all just talk. As far as Richard Aucoin is concerned, he has a piece of legislation in front of him that he has to respond to, and that legislation hasn't changed. Ergo, his approach isn't going to change. That's why we need, clear political direction to the folks like him.
Okay, for sure. And second, do you think, from my perspective, and I could be wrong, but I feel like from our current federal government, ag is quite low on their legislative priority list. Do you think it's possible to get to where they want to go or where Barton thought we could go with it remaining where it is from a legislative capacity?
They've actually been pretty excited, or at least they've said they're excited about agriculture because they're big on growth. They need economic growth. And the whole purpose of the Barton report was that the feds need about 3% economic growth per year to fund their priorities. If they don't have 3% growth per year, they're in trouble. And so that's why Barton then identified agriculture and agri-food. So they're saying all the right things about ag being a priority. Now we need them to actually turn them into action. So we've heard more about agriculture in Ottawa in the last 4 years than we were ever expecting to hear from a pretty urban-centric government. But we got to chip through that 2-foot cement wall at Health Canada to get the regulatory piece fixed. So there's some hopeful signs, but now we have to turn them into meaningful action. Anybody else? Everybody just wants to go on a nice boat in the harbor, right? I'll be around. Thank you very much, everyone.